What happens when one of Hollywood's most revered actors goes head with a veteran political journalist who thinks he has the upper hand? What you're about to witness isn't just another morning interview. It's the moment Denzel Washington decided he was done playing polite. And what unfolded live on national television became one of the most jaw-dropping confrontations in Good Morning America history. Before we dive into this bombshell interview, don't forget to subscribe and drop your take in the comments. Because after watching this, you might just rethink everything you thought you knew about Denzel, media, and morning TV. It all started like any other day at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. The crew was prepping for what was supposed to be a routine interview. Denzel Washington had arrived early, as always, calm, gracious, and professional, ready to promote his latest directorial project. The film was already earning Oscar buzz, and this was meant to be a victory lap. In another corner of the studio, George Stephanopoulos was reviewing his notes. On paper, it was the usual, talking points about Denzel's film, his career, his upcoming work. But George had other plans. He'd been tracking recent remarks Denzel had made about celebrity activism, and he saw an opening. When the cameras rolled, the tension was subtle but unmistakable. Denzel. George began with a politician's smile. Let's talk about your new film. But first, I want to ask you about something you said recently. You suggested actors should stay in their lane when it comes to politics. A lot of people were surprised by that. Denzel's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted. This wasn't what they'd agreed to in pre-interview. Well, George, he said evenly, what I said was that we need to be thoughtful about how we use our platforms. There's a difference between having an opinion and having expertise. But isn't that a little hypocritical? George leaned in, his tone sharpening. You've spoken out on social issues before. Are you saying actors should only speak when it aligns with your views? Denzel didn't flinch. I'm saying people should think before they speak, especially those with a platform. That includes actors and journalists. George's eyebrows lifted. Are you implying the media doesn't think before it speaks? I'm not implying anything, Denzel said, calm but firm. I'm observing that too often. The goal seems to be controversy, not truth. The air went still. Even the seasoned crew could sense it. This wasn't just another segment. George's smile thinned. That's interesting, coming from someone who's built a career playing characters who blur the line between truth and fiction. When you played corrupt cops in Training Day, were you making a political statement, or just staying in your lane as an entertainer? Now Denzel's eyes hardened. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Let me explain something to you, George, he said. When I play a role, I'm telling a story. I'm honest about what I do. You sit in that chair to report facts. That's a very different kind of responsibility. George raised his voice slightly. Honesty, from Hollywood. Let's talk about that. You people love to lecture the public from your ivory towers, flying private, living behind gates, then pretend to understand the struggles of everyday Americans. That's when Denzel leaned in, slowly, methodically, and locked eyes with him. Ivory Tower, he said. George, do you even know where I come from? What I've lived through? What I've seen? George scoffed. I know you've done well for yourself. Big paychecks, luxury homes. You're hardly struggling. Denzel paused. Everyone thought he might walk off. Instead, he leaned closer. You want to talk about insulation, he said, voice low and dangerous. Let's talk about anchors who've never worried about their next meal. Journalists who think they understand suffering because they covered it from the back of an air-conditioned van. The crew exchanged looks. The control room whispered about cutting to commercial. But nobody moved. It was too real. George, feeling the loss of control, pushed harder. Denzel, you're deflecting. This is about responsibility. You reach millions. Don't you think you owe it to them to be more than just an entertainer? Denzel stared him down. His voice dropped again. "The only responsibility I have," he said, "is to be truthful. To myself, to my work, and to the people who support what I do. I don't need a lecture on responsibility from someone more interested in ambushes than journalism." George turned red. Ambushes. These are legitimate questions. The public deserves to know where public figures stand. And the public, Denzel cut in, deserves honest journalism, not this. What followed was silence. Not awkward silence, but the kind that echoes. The kind that says something just changed. And from that moment on, the interview and George would never be the same. They deserve journalists who ask real questions. Denzel said evenly. Not ones trying to manufacture scandals. They deserve better than the performance you're giving right now. The words hit like a gavel. Final, undeniable, and in the silence that followed, you could feel the entire studio lean forward. George Stephanopoulos' carefully composed facade, the practiced smile, the polished tone was beginning to fracture, and everyone saw it. This was no longer a morning show interview. It had morphed into something else entirely, a quiet war between two men with opposing definitions of truth, integrity, and public responsibility. George's complexion flushed crimson. The veteran broadcaster, who'd grilled presidents and prime ministers with surgical control, now looked rattled. Cornered by an actor whose calm had become a weapon. Performance. George repeated, his voice cracking as he tried to recover. "I've been doing this for over 30 years, Denzel. I think I know the difference between journalism and performance." Denzel studied him with a cool, penetrating stare, like a man dissecting not a person, but a pattern of behavior. 30 years of what, exactly? He asked, voice low. "Because what I'm watching right now, it's not journalism, it's a setup. You came in here with an agenda, and now that it's not going the way you rehearsed in your head, you're flailing." George leaned forward, snapping. "My agenda is to get answers. Something that clearly makes you uncomfortable." "No," Denzel replied, his voice steady but rising in force. "Your agenda is to create a viral moment. You're not here to talk about my work. You're not even here to listen. You're here to provoke, to bait. And when I don't take it, you panic." The camera operators instinctively zoomed in. They knew they were filming a moment that would be replayed for years to come. A live implosion, not of a guest, but of a host. George's hands clenched tightly on the desk, knuckles whitening as he tried to regain authority. "You know what, Denzel?" he said bitterly. "Maybe the real issue here is you can't handle tough questions. Maybe Hollywood's made you so soft, so used to people kissing your feet, that you've forgotten what accountability looks like." That's when Denzel's composure shifted. Not broken, but sharpened. A colder calm settled in, tinged with something far more dangerous, restrained fury. "Accountability," Denzel repeated, barely above a whisper, and yet somehow the words seemed to echo. "Let me tell you what that actually means. Accountability is showing up to your work every day and giving everything you have to your craft. It's being honest with yourself about why you do what you do. It's not using your position to ambush people who walked in here in good faith." George laughed, short and hollow. "This is a news program, not a promotional ad. If you can't handle real questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." Denzel stood up. The studio froze. It looked like he was about to walk off. Everyone held their breath. But instead, he stood still, towering over George, calm, unshaken. "Real questions?" Denzel repeated slowly. "Okay, George, let me ask you one." He leaned in just slightly, his tone now somewhere between a whisper and a reckoning. "When you wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, are you proud of what you've become? Are you proud of using your platform to tear people down instead of lifting them up? Are you proud that your first instinct isn't understanding, but conflict?" George opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He blinked, swallowed, searched for a comeback. For the first time in his decades-long career, he was speechless. The power dynamic had flipped. George was no longer the interviewer. He was the one under scrutiny, exposed by someone he'd underestimated. "I don't have to answer your questions," he finally muttered, voice shaky. "You're the guest." "You're right," Denzel said, nodding. "You don't? Just like I don't have to sit here and be disrespected by someone who's forgotten what integrity looks like." The room was silent. Even the background hum of movement had stopped. The mechanical whir of the cameras was the only sound left. The crew was frozen, witnessing not just an interview, but a reckoning. Trying to salvage what was left, George turned to the camera with a thin, shaky smile. "Well, folks, seems like we're having a bit of a spirited discussion about the role of celebrities in politics." But Denzel wasn't done. "No, George," he interrupted. "That's not what this is. And you know it?" He stepped closer, no longer speaking for George, but for everyone watching. "This is about respect, about professionalism, about the line between journalism and ambush, and about what happens when someone decides they're done being manipulated on live television." George turned back toward him, his mask of objectivity now completely gone, and Denzel just looked at him, silent, steady, unflinching. For the first time in the interview, it was clear. George hadn't just lost control of the conversation, he'd lost the room. "You're standing over me, raising your voice, acting like you're some kind of victim, just because I asked tough questions," George snapped. "I'm not raising my voice," Denzel replied calmly, his tone smooth, steady, and ice cold. "And I'm standing because sitting across from you is making me feel complicit in whatever this is supposed to be." He paused, letting the silence work like pressure on a wound. "I'm not a victim, George. I'm someone who refuses to be victimized." The distinction landed with surgical precision, sharp and irreversible. Even George seemed briefly stunned by the clarity of it, but instead of retreating, he lashed out. This right here, is what's wrong with Hollywood," he barked, his voice rising. "You people think you're untouchable. You moralize, you preach, but the second someone challenges you, you fall apart." Denzel smiled. Not the kind of smile that says, "You're right." The kind that says you just revealed exactly who you are. "I haven't fallen apart, George," he said softly. "I'm still here. I'm still answering your questions. Even though they're not really questions, they're accusations, dressed up in question marks." He took a step forward, not aggressive, but deliberate. "So since we're being honest, tell me, when did your job stop being about seeking truth and start being about tearing people down? When did controversy become more important to you than clarity?" George's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth, struggled, then forced out, "My job is to hold people accountable, especially powerful ones." "No," Denzel said, his voice now firm. "Your job is to inform the public, to ask questions that help people understand the world, not distort it. Your job is not to create theater at the expense of truth. It's not to make yourself look smart by trying to make someone else look small." By now, the interview had completely derailed. Producers were frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but George waved them off. Too deep, too far gone to back down. "You're lecturing me about journalism," George said, his voice edged with open hostility. "You're an actor, Denzel. You pretend for a living. What gives you the right to question how I do my job?" Denzel looked at him, and for a moment, there was genuine sadness in his expression. "Because, George, as I may pretend to be other people, but I'm honest about it. You're pretending to be a journalist, and you've convinced yourself it's the same thing." The words dropped like a verdict. The studio fell into a hush so deep it rang in everyone's ears. George's face cycled through shock, rage, and something nearing panic. For the first time in his long career, he was on the wrong side of the lens. "How dare you question my integrity?" he snapped. "I've won Emmys, Peabodys. I've interviewed every president for 2 decades. I don't care about your trophies," Denzel replied, unmoved. Awards don't make you a good journalist. Questions do, curiosity does. Respect for truth does, and right now, you're showing none of those things. George shot to his feet. All pretense of professionalism gone. Oh, you want to see journalism? He hissed. Let's talk about your past, Denzel. Let's talk about the choices you've made. The people you've aligned yourself with. Let's see how you handle real scrutiny. The air in the studio dropped 10 degrees. The threat wasn't subtle, but Denzel didn't flinch. He stepped closer to George's desk, and when he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. But it hit like thunder. Go ahead, George. Do your worst. Dig. Find whatever you think you can. Because when you live with integrity, you don't fear the truth. You welcome it. He paused, then delivered the finishing blow. But ask yourself this, can you say the same? George's face went pale. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, voice suddenly fragile. It means, Denzel said, locking eyes with him, that when you make threats like that, you better make sure your house is clean, because the internet works both ways. And people are watching this right now, watching you threaten to destroy someone for not playing your game. That was the moment it sank in. The reality of what George had just done, on live television, no less, started to crash over him. This wasn't just a bad interview anymore. It was a career-defining disaster. I wasn't making threats. George stammered, trying to retreat, trying to rewind the moment. But it was too late. The internet was watching, and it had already started recording. I was simply pointing out that public figures should expect scrutiny. No, Denzel said, his voice steady and low. You were making threats. That's what people do when they're losing an argument. Bullies always reach for intimidation when they run out of logic. He leaned forward just slightly. But here's what you don't get, George. I've dealt with bullies my whole life. I grew up with them. I've worked with them. I've learned how to stand my ground. George's breath hitched, his facade cracking. The confidence he'd worn at the start of the interview was gone, replaced by something far less composed. You're twisting my words, he said, almost panicked. This was supposed to be about your movie, your career. You're the one who made this personal. Denzel let out a short, humorless laugh. I made it personal. George, you came at me the moment we went live. Loaded questions. Smirking accusations pretending to be journalism. You expected me to flinch. When I didn't, you lost control. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This was always personal. You were just better at hiding it at the start. The silence in the studio was thick. There wasn't a live audience, but if there had been, they'd be leaning forward in their seats. Even the production crew, seasoned professionals who'd seen it all, stood frozen watching. George tried one last time to reel it back in. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot, he said, his tone shifting to something almost conciliatory. Let's start over. Talk about the film. Like we planned. But Denzel was already shaking his head. No, George. You don't get to hit someone's character, question their integrity, imply threats, and then pivot like it was all just a misunderstanding when it doesn't go your way. Oh, George's voice dropped to a pleading whisper. Denzel, please, this is live. We can work this out. We could have, Denzel replied. We could have had a real conversation. About the film. About the craft. Even about tough issues. But you didn't want that. You came looking for a headline. An ambush. And now you're angry because it failed. George looked shattered. His posture slumped. His expression empty. And Denzel? Unbothered. Grounded. Still in complete command. Then Denzel reached up, unclipped the mic from his jacket, and gently placed it on George's desk. I came here to talk about storytelling. About how film can move people. Instead, I walked into whatever this was. And frankly, I think your viewers deserved better. I know I did. George opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He looked like a man who had just watched his career detonate in real time. For what it's worth, Denzel added, his voice softer now. "I hope you figure out what happened to you. I hope you remember why you became a journalist. Because the person sitting across from me right now, this isn't a journalist. This is someone who forgot what the job was about." And with that, Denzel turned and walked off the Good Morning America set. George was left alone, standing behind his desk, the cameras still rolling. The control room was chaos. Producers shouting. Directors gesturing wildly. No one knowing whether to cut or keep rolling. Then, as if realizing the final blow had already landed, George looked into the camera and muttered, "We'll be right back." His voice was barely audible. The screen faded to commercial. But the silence in the studio lingered. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something no one would forget. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was the televised collapse of everything George Stephanopoulos had built his career on. Dismantled not with shouting, but with calm truth from a man who refused to be shaken. By that evening, the footage was everywhere. Social media was flooded with clips. Hashtags like Fave Denzel Unshaken and Fight George Exposed trended worldwide. Media analysts, journalism professors, and everyday viewers all weighed in. One man stayed composed. One man cracked under pressure. And as the studio lights dimmed and the crew quietly packed away their gear, one thing was clear. Denzel Washington hadn't just ended an interview. He had delivered a masterclass. What do you think? Did Denzel go too far? Or did George get exactly what he asked for? Let me know your take in the comments below.